A nation scarred the enduring legacy of #EndSARS. The year 2020 marked a turning point in Nigeria's history. The #EndSARS movement, a youth-led outcry against police brutality, shook the nation to its core. It unveiled the deep-seated anger and frustration felt by many Nigerians, particularly the youth. The protests, initially sparked by the notorious Special Anti-Robbery Squad, quickly morphed into a broader call for change. Nigerians from all walks of life united to demand accountability, transparency, and an end to systemic corruption. The government's response to #EndSARS was heavy-handed, marked by a brutal crackdown that culminated in the tragic events of October 20, 2020, at the Lekki tollgate. The Lekki tollgate shooting, where security forces opened fire on peaceful protesters, became a chilling symbol of the government's willingness to silence dissent. The incident sent shockwaves throughout the nation and drew international condemnation. The legacy of #EndSARS continues to cast a long shadow over Nigeria. The government's actions during that tumultuous period eroded public trust, leaving a residue of anger and skepticism. The events of 2020 shattered the illusion of peace and stability, exposing the fragility of the social contract between the government and its people. #EndSARS was more than just a protest. It was a watershed moment that awakened a generation. It demonstrated the power of collective action and the potential for change. However, it also highlighted the high cost of dissent in Nigeria and the government's fear of its citizens' collective voice. The price of silence, economic hardship, and public discontent. The fear of protests in Nigeria is inextricably linked to the dire economic realities faced by its citizens. Years of corruption, mismanagement, and economic instability have left many Nigerians struggling to survive. The removal of fuel subsidies in 2024, coupled with the devaluation of the naira, exacerbated an already precarious situation. Inflation soared, further eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Nigerians. The rising cost of living has placed immense pressure on households. Basic necessities, such as food, transportation, and housing, have become increasingly unaffordable. Unemployment, particularly among young people, remains stubbornly high, leaving many feeling hopeless and disillusioned. The gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen, fueling resentment and a sense of injustice. The economic hardships faced by Nigerians have created a fertile ground for discontent. The government's failure to address these issues, combined with its perceived indifference to the plight of ordinary citizens, has only amplified the potential for unrest. For many Nigerians, protests are seen as a last resort, a desperate attempt to have their voices heard and to demand a better future. The government's fear of protests stems from the recognition that economic hardship can be a powerful catalyst for social unrest. History is replete with examples of governments toppled by popular uprisings fueled by economic grievances. The Nigerian government, acutely aware of this historical precedent, is wary of any movement that could potentially destabilize its grip on power. Generation Rising youth activism and the power of social media. Nigeria, like many African nations, boasts a youthful population. This demographic, often characterized by its energy, idealism, and tech savviness, has become a potent force for social and political change. Young Nigerians, armed with smartphones and a deep desire for a better future, are increasingly using social media platforms to organize, mobilize, and amplify their voices. The #EndSARS movement showcased the transformative power of youth-led activism. Social media platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, and WhatsApp played a pivotal role in mobilizing support, disseminating information, and galvanizing action. The #EndSARS became a rallying cry, transcending geographical boundaries and capturing the attention of the world. The government, wary of the power of social media to mobilize dissent, has responded with attempts to control the narrative and stifle online freedom. There have been calls for social media regulation, and internet shutdowns have been implemented during periods of heightened tension. However, these attempts to control the flow of information have largely proven ineffective, as young Nigerians have found creative ways to circumvent censorship and continue to make their voices heard. The government's fear of youth activism is rooted in the recognition that young people, unburdened by the cynicism and apathy that often accompany age, possess a unique capacity for mobilization and action. They represent a generation that is no longer content to accept the status quo, a generation that demands accountability, transparency, and a stake in shaping the future of their nation. A crisis of trust, corruption, and the erosion of public faith. At the heart of Nigeria's fear of protests lies a deep-seated crisis of trust. Decades of endemic corruption, coupled with a culture of impunity for those in power, have eroded public faith in government institutions. The perception of widespread corruption, from the highest levels of government to everyday interactions with public officials, has created a climate of cynicism and disillusionment. Nigerians have grown weary of empty promises and unfulfilled pledges of reform. The government's failure to address systemic corruption, despite repeated vows to tackle the issue, has fueled a sense of betrayal and a belief that the system is rigged against ordinary citizens. The lack of accountability for those who engage in corrupt practices, regardless of their position or influence, has further deepened public mistrust. This crisis of trust has created a volatile environment where even small incidents can ignite widespread anger and frustration. The government's fear of protests is rooted in the recognition that any spark could ignite a firestorm of discontent, potentially leading to a loss of control. The erosion of public trust is perhaps the most significant challenge facing Nigeria today. It undermines the legitimacy of government institutions, fuels cynicism and apathy, and creates a fertile ground for instability. Addressing this crisis of trust requires a fundamental shift in the way power is exercised in Nigeria, one that prioritizes accountability, transparency, and the rule of law.